The airport announcement chimed at the exact moment the first-class boarding pass was torn from Anthony Caldwell's hand, and in that instant, the world he had spent a lifetime building seemed to tilt. "You are obstructing the boarding process. Please, step aside," Kyle Benson's sharp voice cut through the crowded terminal. A black CEO in a perfectly tailored suit, carrying the presence of a man who had steered a multi-billion-dollar corporation, was being treated like someone unworthy of stepping into first class. The shock came fast, cold, and clean, like a blade slicing through the confident armor Anthony had spent 45 years forging. But it was only the first spark. Seattle-Tacoma Airport glowed as brightly as any morning sunlight pouring through the glass ceiling and scattering across polished stone floors, while passengers dragged suitcases and weaved past one another, unaware of the invisible battle taking place in their midst. But for Anthony, every glance, every word, every subtle nod, implying that he did not belong, felt like an invisible pair of scissors slowly cutting away at a patience already tested too many times in his life. The morning had begun differently. Waking up in his penthouse overlooking Lake Union, Anthony stood before the wide mirror, adjusting his deep blue tie, the color he always chose for important days. His reflection showed not only a successful CEO, but also the weary resolve of a boy who once ran 3 miles every morning through a Detroit working-class neighborhood to avoid falling into the same traps that swallowed so many around him. He had never possessed the privilege of making mistakes, and today he absolutely could not, because in just a few hours, a $300 million deal would be signed, ushering in a new era for Caldwell Systems. That was why he had to be on this flight on time, in the correct seat, in the correct role. But the world does not operate on the logic of those who have spent their entire lives striving. It operates on the assumptions of people who lose nothing by judging others. And at the very first check-in counter, Anthony saw it clearly. The older agent's eyes swept from his hair to his shoes, as if trying to determine whether Anthony's attire was genuine or just a costume worn to slip into a space meant for people with money. The look was not unfamiliar. He had seen it in boardrooms and coffee shops on the street, and even during his first job interview after graduating from Wharton, when someone asked skeptically, "Did you really study there?" But he simply smiled. Since childhood, he had learned how to stand tall in the storm, and this morning he stood tall again, until he was selected for a random inspection. Anthony knew, and people like him always knew, that this randomness was never random. The lingering looks, the repeated questions, the hands unzipping his luggage slower than necessary, all of it played like a script he had watched too many times. Yet he stayed calm. He had faced obstacles far greater, the deals the entire industry claimed he was not qualified to lead the funding rounds where people asked whether he was the actual operator or just a diversity face for someone else's company. But he had built Caldwell Systems from a small office into a corporation shaping the future of national cybersecurity. He had broken enough barriers to understand that breakthroughs never come from avoiding confrontation. So when Anthony approached Gate Bravo 14, he walked with the confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was, a first-class passenger, a platinum member, and the CEO of a company about to redefine the technology sector. Then Kyle appeared. A young face, a touch of arrogance, the kind of overblown confidence possessed by someone who holds authority for only a few seconds, yet believes it grants him the right to judge an entire lifetime. "Your seat has been reassigned." Those 5 words made Anthony stop cold. Reason-weight distribution adjustment, Kyle answered, eyes refusing to meet his. A clumsy lie. No prior notice. No technical explanation. No other first-class passenger reassigned. Only him. Anthony felt his chest tighten, not because he had lost a first-class seat, but because of how painfully familiar the moment was. The feeling of being pushed aside once again, even though he had surpassed every standard the world had ever placed in front of him. But this time was different. As Anthony inhaled deeply, fighting the rising wave of anger in his chest, his eyes caught something that made him pause. Seat 1 Alpha. Empty. Bright. Meant for him. In that instant, a flame rose inside him. Not one of rage, but of truth. The truth that if he stayed silent, this would continue not just for him, but for thousands of others with no voice, no status, no protection. A truth that pulled him back to childhood, the harsh look from his teacher when he earned an A, the laughter of white teammates who told him he didn't belong at that school, his father's warning, "You will need to work twice as hard just to be seen as half." His father had been right, and Anthony had lived that truth his entire life. But today that number would change, because for the first time in many years, Anthony felt that someone had crossed a line too far, and he knew this moment was no longer about him. It was about everyone who came after him, everyone like him, everyone who would never get the chance to stand up unless even a CEO refused to stay silent. So he lifted his head, eyes steady and burning, and in that moment, a quiet decision crystallized, a decision that would shake the entire flight, ignite headlines, and force the aviation industry to rewrite its policies. Anthony Caldwell would not be silent. Not today, and certainly not on this flight. The air inside the first-class cabin thickened the moment Anthony stepped through the aircraft door, his leather shoes sinking into the plush carpet, while his chest felt impossibly heavy. Heather Collins stood at the entryway, a perfect service smile on her lips, but eyes as sharp as a blade. When she spotted the Economy Plus ticket in his hand, the corner of her mouth lifted into a thin, precise curve of satisfaction. "Welcome, please. Turn right," she said softly, her voice gentle enough to brush away a speck of dust. Yet beneath that softness was a stark denial. And Anthony knew all too well that to her, he was not a first-class passenger, not a platinum member, not a CEO securing the biggest deal of his life. To her, he was simply a black man who had wandered into a space meant for those who belonged here. As Anthony walked down the aisle, the warm, golden lights washed over faces, sipping champagne, reading financial newspapers, scrolling on tablets with the quiet confidence of people who believed the world always bent in their favor. A few looked up at him briefly, then turned away just as quickly as if he were background noise, unimportant, unworthy of notice. But then the eyes of Lena Morrison, the black flight attendant stationed in the mid-cabin, lingered for more than a second. Her gaze carried understanding empathy and something else, a long, suppressed anger. She gave a slight nod, subtle enough to go unseen by others, yet Anthony caught it instantly. A silent signal. I know what is happening. I have seen it too many times. The aircraft continued boarding, the sounds of rolling suitcases, footsteps overhead, bins opening and closing, blending into the familiar symphony of commercial flights. But inside Anthony's mind, everything quieted until only one question echoed. Should I accept seat 22, sit in silence, and treat this as just another bad day? Or should I do something row 22? Charlie appeared the smaller seat wedged between two others. Anthony lowered himself into it, and a wave of suffocation washed over him. Not from the lack of space, but from the disrespect. That was when Brandon Hughes appeared, almost as if fate had placed him there. "Excuse me, are you Anthony Caldwell?" he asked, voice tinged with curiosity and surprise. Anthony turned. Brandon continued, "I interviewed with your research division once. I did not think the CEO of Caldwell Systems would be sitting in row 22. A heavy pause. Then Anthony explained, briefly, just enough. Brandon's expression shifted from surprise to outrage, then hardened into determination. "I'm going to verify this," he said, rising to his feet. He strode toward first class. Less than a minute later, he returned holding his phone out. A photo seat 1 Alpha illuminated empty, with no sign of being reserved. "You were right," Brandon whispered, his voice sharp and dangerous. "They lied to you." And he posted the photo on Twitter. One tap, one tweet, one wildfire. Anthony felt his entire body freeze, then ignite all at once, because this was no longer just about him. It was spreading beyond the metal walls of the plane. But before he could think further, Lena appeared beside him, like a quiet shadow. She pretended to check the overhead bin, but her hand dropped a folded piece of paper onto his tray table in a single swift motion. She walked away without a word. Anthony opened the paper. An internal manifest printed from the system. Seat 1 Alpha Caldwell. Anthony, no change. Request. No weight adjustment requirement. No technical issue. No alteration to the seat map. At the bottom corner, a small handwritten line. "They lied to you. I'm sorry." Signed, Lena. A chill ran down Anthony's spine. This was the proof. Irrefutable. Unalterable. Unspinnable. Then his phone vibrated. A message from Marcus heard the competitor sent their team to San Jose early. "We cannot miss this meeting. Everything depends on you." A blow straight to the chest. Two paths now lay before him. One meant sacrificing dignity to save the meeting. The other meant jeopardizing the meeting to protect his dignity. One path was for the company. One was for himself. One was for the future of hundreds of employees. One was for the truth of what was happening on this aircraft, the truth so many others had lived in silence. One path was logic. The other was justice. The announcement chimed, preparing to close the aircraft doors. "All passengers please remain seated." But Anthony could not remain seated. Not today. He unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood. A passenger behind him lifted their head in shock. Brandon held his breath. Lena turned, eyes tightening with worry. Heather descended from first class, her face draining of color. "Sir, sit down immediately." Heather snapped, her voice sharp and rising, as if he had just committed something dangerous. Anthony stood in the aisle, tall, steady, his eyes deep and calm, in a way that was almost terrifying. "I will not sit down," he said, each word falling like a weight on the floor. The entire cabin fell silent. Even the engines seemed to quiet, waiting. And Anthony knew this was only the beginning. The moment Anthony straightened his spine in the narrow aisle, the cabin seemed to stop breathing. Every motion stretched into sharp, frozen slices of time. Heather Collins stepped forward, her high heels striking the carpet like the pounding of a judge's gavel. "I am ordering you to sit down immediately." She repeated, her voice higher, sharper, carrying the authority of someone who believed that lifting her chin was enough to make the world obey. But Anthony did not move. He stood still like an anchor, his eyes fixed on Heather, not angry, not chaotic, just filled with the strange resolve of someone who has endured too much and has decided he will endure no more. A passenger in row 24 whispered, his voice trembling, "What is happening?" another replied softly. They reassigned him to economy. No reason. An elderly woman lowered her gaze toward Anthony, her eyes carrying sympathy and decades of memories of injustice she had never dared to speak against. When Heather reached out as if to push Anthony aside, Brandon rose sharply from row 22, lifting his phone and recording. His voice rang out calm, but crystalline, cutting through the thick tension like a bell in fog. I am documenting this mistreatment. I will testify if necessary. Heather froze, just for a second. But it was enough for the undercurrent to shift. Anthony looked at Brandon and gave a slight nod, a quiet acknowledgement of an unexpected ally. But Heather did not back down. She leaned close, speaking in a low voice, meant for him alone. You are delaying the flight. You are causing trouble. Anthony answered his voice, low and deep, yet rumbling through the silent cabin like distant thunder. I am not causing trouble. I am asking for the truth. Several passengers inhaled sharply. A few lifted their phones to record. A middle-aged man reached for the call button, then pulled back, realizing he wanted no part in choosing sides, only peace. Peace. A concept Anthony had grown accustomed to living without, even after reaching a position attained by only 0.2% of black professionals in the tech world. The click of the cockpit door unlocking echoed like the curtain rising on a grand stage. The first officer stepped out. First Logan Pierce, his face tense as he scanned the scene. Then the captain emerged, Mitchell Sanders, tall grey-haired, his face lined with decades of long-haul flights. He looked at Anthony first, then Heather, then the phones raised throughout the cabin. He understood instantly. This was not a minor issue. This was a media bomb. "What is going on here?" Captain Sanders asked. Heather jumped in first, quick and sharp, trying to seize control. This passenger is refusing to sit and is not complying with safety instructions. Anthony did not let her finish. He held up 2 boarding passes, the first-class seat, 1 Alpha, and the Economy Plus seat, 22 Charlie. "I was reassigned without a valid reason," he said, slowly. "And my seat is still empty." Captain Sanders turned to Heather. "Can you confirm this?" Heather pressed her lips together. "I followed the gate agent's information." The captain shifted his gaze to Anthony, his tone less rigid. "Can you explain what happened at the gate?" Anthony did. Briefly, without embellishment, only truth. But truth, spoken by someone exhausted from a lifetime of proving he deserved to stand where he stood, had the force to crack invisible walls. Brandon stepped forward to support him, showing the photo of seat 1 Alpha empty. A passenger in first class added, "I saw him being stopped for no reason while we were all allowed through. The pieces fell cleanly into place." And Heather felt it. Her face paled. From the rear cabin, Lena hurried forward with the manifest in her hand. "Captain," she said, her voice steady but strained, "I have important information." Heather snapped Lena, "You are not allowed to." But Lena ignored her, handing the paper to the captain. Captain Sanders skimmed it, and his expression changed instantly. No hesitation, no uncertainty, no doubt. He lifted his head, his voice carrying weight. "Mr. Caldwell, according to internal records, you were never reassigned. There is no technical justification for this change." The cabin erupted in murmurs. Brandon turned to Anthony, eyes bright like lightning. "I am posting again," he said. Heather stepped forward, her voice trembling with the effort to maintain control. "Captain, I think we should." But Captain Sanders raised a hand, silencing her. "Ms. Collins," he said, "please step back. 1 sentence." but the power behind it was enough to extinguish the authority Heather thought she held. The captain turned to Anthony, and in a voice free of rank or distance, simply one human recognizing another who had been wronged, he asked, "How would you like this?" Resolved, Anthony looked around the cabin at people waiting for him to stand up, because they could not, and at people wishing he would stay quiet so the plane could depart. He remembered his father's words. Some battles you walk away from to survive, but some battles you fight, so others can live right. Outside the window, the Seattle sun cast an orange glow across the aircraft like a warning. Inside, every eye rested on Anthony, and he knew with absolute clarity that this moment would ripple far beyond a single flight, shaking a system far too comfortable with silence. Anthony took a deep breath. His heart thundered louder than the engines. His decision struck with the force of a sudden drop in altitude. "I want to speak to the airline's management right now," he said. "And until the truth is addressed, this aircraft will not take off." A shockwave passed through the cabin. Some passengers gasped, some held their breath, some pressed record. Captain Sanders studied Anthony for a long moment, then nodded once. "Very well," he said. "I will call them." And in that instant, in the cramped cabin of a plane, whose doors had not yet closed, Anthony Caldwell, a man underestimated his entire life, made the entire sky stop. Just before the cabin door finally slid shut, the sky began to shift colors. And so did the fate of this flight. In the silent cabin, Captain Mitchell Sanders stepped back and lifted the internal comm, his voice dropping to a deep, controlled current just before it broke the surface. "Call ground management to the aircraft. Immediately." A wave of murmurs rolled through the rows, a mixture of confusion, caution, outrage, and curiosity rising together like a slow-turning storm over open water. Heather Collins stood frozen, her face draining of color as she realized nothing was under her control anymore. She tried to speak, but the words died in her throat when Captain Sanders turned toward her, his gaze sharp as steel. "Miss Collins, return to your position. Now." No one had ever heard the captain address a crew member like that. No one. And that alone made the entire cabin hold its breath. Heather stepped back, her high heels hitting the carpet with the heavy thud of someone walking away from the crumbling remnants of the small authority she had relied on to enforce unspoken bias. Anthony remained in the aisle standing tall, as if held upright by an invisible line stretched from his past to this very moment. His eyes no longer burned with sudden anger, but carried the cold precision of a man who had endured too many injustices and had finally decided that enough was enough. Brandon Hughes continued recording, glancing at Anthony with a mixture of respect and righteous fury. Lena Morrison stood to one side, her hands clenched, and when Anthony looked her way, she offered a small nod, a silent message. "You are not alone." At that moment, the aircraft door swung open again. A draft of cold air spilled in from the jet bridge, and a man stepped aboard with urgent footsteps, radio in hand, name tag reading Gregory Thompson, Customer Service Supervisor. He scanned the cabin, not yet understanding the full scope of the situation, until his eyes landed on Anthony, a black man, standing in the aisle with 2 boarding passes in hand. Then he turned to Captain Sanders. "What seems to be the issue?" the captain replied without hesitation. A first-class passenger was downgraded without any valid justification, and his original seat remains empty. Gregory looked to Heather. "Ms. Collins, can you confirm this?" Heather opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Lena stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly, yet clear. "I saw the manifest. Seat 1 Alpha was assigned to Mr. Caldwell. There were no change requests. Heather snapped Lena U, but Gregory raised a hand. "Let me handle this." He looked at the manifest Lena handed him, then at the 2 boarding passes in Anthony's hand. His face paled. Anthony met his eyes, speaking in a calm, almost unsettling tone. "I simply want to know why I was removed from the first-class seat I paid for how I was treated differently, and who made that decision." Gregory swallowed hard. Not because Anthony yelled, not because he threatened anything, but because that calmness, the restrained clarity of a man who had endured countless slights and discriminations, had a way of forcing people to confront the darkest parts of themselves. Then a voice rose from the front of the aircraft, not loud, but resonant enough to strike like a drum beat. "I am a witness. I saw him being delayed while the rest of us were allowed through." A 70-year-old man in seat 3, Charlie, stood his posture firm like a retired serviceman. There was no technical reason. It was selective. A young woman in row 4 leaned toward Gregory and whispered, "I saw it too." No one else was screened like he was. Another passenger raised his phone. "I recorded the whole thing." Brandon stepped closer. "I am a technology journalist. This story is spreading fast. This is no longer a minor dispute." Gregory blinked rapidly, looking from Brandon to the recording phones to Anthony, and he knew without doubt that this was not a routine disagreement. This was a crisis detonating in real time. The air had turned so heavy it could be sliced. Gregory finally exhaled. "We apologize for the inconvenience. We will immediately return you to your first-class seat." But Anthony didn't move. "No," he said, his voice low but solid as a locked steel door. "I do not want a personal apology. I want transparency." Gregory hesitated, "meaning I want to know what led to this decision. And it must be addressed before the aircraft takes off." A man behind him whispered to his companion, "Oh my God, he is holding the plane." But his tone held no mockery, only awe. Brandon's mouth curved slightly. "This is going to be huge." Gregory turned slowly to Heather. "Ms. Collins, what happened?" Heather clenched her hands, forcing composure, but her lips twitched. "I was asked to reconfirm his ticket. I thought, what did you think Anthony asked? Not harshly simply asking. The question was simple, but it cut deep, and Heather's face flushed crimson. No one spoke. Everyone waited. Finally, Heather exhaled sharply, her voice twisted like bent metal. "I thought we needed to verify his ticket more thoroughly." As she stopped, she could not say the rest, but everyone knew. He did not look like someone who belonged in first class. A soft sigh drifted from the back rows, like the first cold wind of winter sliding into the room. Anthony closed his eyes briefly. He had heard versions of this sentence hundreds of times, in hundreds of forms through letters scrutinized more than others, meetings delayed opportunities, skipped security, suspicious compliments coated in condescending surprise. "You do not look like success. You do not look like leadership. You do not look like a CEO." Heather had merely spoken aloud what countless silent prejudices had whispered into his life. Gregory's face drained completely. Lena turned away to hide her tears. Brandon clenched his jaw and moved the camera closer. Captain Sanders placed a hand on the seat back, his voice rising with the authority of a final verdict. "Ms. Collins, you have just admitted discriminatory conduct." The cabin erupted in whispers, outrage, the rapid clicking of record buttons. Heather trembled, and like the final blow shattering the false wall she had hidden behind Lena, spoke softly but loud enough for the cabin to hear. "This is not the first time." Gregory spun around. What Lena lifted her head, eyes red but unwavering. This is not the first time she has done this to passengers of color. The cabin seemed to turn to stone. A vein in Gregory's neck pulsed violently. Brandon whispered almost reverently, "This is a time bomb." Anthony stood there alone, yet no longer isolated, because in that moment the truth had surfaced, not buried beneath polite smiles or clean uniforms or harmless-sounding procedures. The truth had erupted, and from that moment on the plane was not simply delayed, it was grounded by justice. Anthony looked Gregory in the eye and delivered the sentence that made the entire cabin sway. "From this moment on, I will not sit down. Not until the truth is resolved." And the world outside social media, the press, the passengers, and the airline itself waited for the next move in this unfolding moment. Anthony Caldwell had just grounded the aircraft, not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. Because the truth cannot take off while chained to injustice. The cabin door closed again, without the usual hum of engines starting up, and the aircraft sank into an uncanny silence, a silence not of peace, but of strained anticipation, as if every passenger was trapped inside the same breath, stretched to its breaking point. Gregory Thompson stood still for a moment, hands pressed against the back of a seat, as if holding on to the last fragile thread of authority he had left. But the truth was already beyond his reach, because inside this cabin, only one person remained in control: Anthony Caldwell. Brandon kept recording, capturing every subtle shift in Anthony's expression, every second of quiet, as if magnified through a lens, amplifying the weight of a story, spreading across social media like dry brush catching fire. Each new notification flashing on Anthony's phone lit up like lightning hashtags, accelerating outraged comments, flooding in thousands, watching the video Brandon had posted, all of it fueling a blaze that Anthony could no longer extinguish by simply sitting down and staying silent. "Mr. Thompson," Anthony said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the air like a blade, slicing clean through fabric. "I will not return to my seat until the airline provides a clear explanation. Why was I and only I removed from first class? Who made that decision? And what was the real reason?" Gregory opened his mouth, but Anthony lifted a hand, a light gesture, yet sharp enough to silence him. "Do not mention a system error. I work in technology. I know very well that systems do not create bias on their own. People do." A woman in row 18 whispered, "My God, he is right." A young man near the back called out, "Stand up for him." Some passengers tapped their armrests in agreement, others murmured support. Heather looked around, her face pale, as she realized the wave of backing Anthony was receiving was no longer containable. It was growing row by row, like a swelling tide, crashing against everything she had tried to hold together. Gregory grabbed his phone and made a rushed call. Words like crisis, recorded viral, and discrimination spilled from his lips, each one sinking Heather deeper into the consequences of her own actions. When he hung up, his expression was so grave that everyone around him understood instantly that this situation had surpassed the boundaries of a single flight. "Mr. Caldwell, Gregory," said the regional director, "wants to speak with you immediately, through the cockpit intercom." Anthony nodded, but his eyes swept the cabin as though he was addressing the entire plane, not just Gregory. "I will hear what they have to say, but I will not allow the truth to be smoothed over by an empty apology." As Anthony stepped forward, passengers watched each of his steps with rapt attention, as though they were witnessing someone walk on behalf of all the moments they themselves had stayed silent. Heather moved aside as he passed, but Anthony did not cast a condemning look her way. Not because he forgave her, but because in his eyes she had become nothing more than a small link in a long decayed chain that had been allowed to exist for far too long. The cockpit door opened. Inside the space was tight lit by the glow of the control panels reflecting off Captain Sanders' face, making him look both weary and more alert than ever. Mr. Caldwell, came a woman's voice, over the comm system, sharp, yet attempting to sound composed. This is Rebecca Monroe, Regional Director of Northwest Skies. I want to offer my sincerest apologies for the unfortunate experience you have had. My experience, Anthony replied, is the result of deliberate choices, not an accident. A long exhale slipped through the speaker. Gregory swallowed hard. Captain Sanders looked toward Anthony and gave him a subtle nod, encouraging him forward. "We are conducting an internal investigation," Rebecca said. "But for the flight to continue, I ask for your cooperation in returning to your seat while we prepare an official statement." Anthony allowed himself a small smile, not one of amusement, but one of a man who had seen this play out far too many times, who had watched polished apologies dissolve into silence without any real change. But that would not happen today. "I will return to my seat," Anthony said, his voice sharper than a surgical blade when the airline confirms 3 things. First, that the reason for my reassignment is publicly disclosed to all passengers on this flight. Second, that the airline commits to reviewing crew training protocols related to unconscious bias. Third, that a concrete plan is presented to ensure this never happens to any other passenger again. The silence on the other end stretched long. Then Rebecca spoke, her voice lower. "Your demands are substantial," Anthony answered instantly. "Not as substantial as being treated as someone unworthy, despite paying, complying, and doing nothing wrong." Captain Sanders pressed the mic off and said quietly, "You are doing the right thing. I support you." A single sentence from a veteran captain felt like reinforcement sliding firmly into place inside Anthony's spine. Then Rebecca returned slower this time. "I am in an emergency meeting with the chief executive. We will provide a response within minutes." Anthony stepped out of the cockpit. When the door closed behind him, the cabin erupted in applause, not loud or chaotic, but resonant like a declaration from dozens of witnesses who had finally seen someone speak the truth they had carried in silence. Heather lowered her head. Lena pressed her lips together, fighting tears. Brandon approached and placed a hand on Anthony's shoulder. "You just changed the game." Anthony looked out the window. The aircraft was still firmly on the ground. And he realized something. Sometimes to change the world, all it takes is one person choosing to keep the world on the ground for just a few minutes. Because those minutes are enough to ignite a conversation that no one can ignore anymore. And today, that person was him. Anthony Caldwell, the man the sky could no longer silence. When Anthony stepped back into the cabin, no one saw him as a disruptor anymore. Every eye followed him, as if he were the central figure in a public trial where the evidence had finally begun to surface. The looks people gave him were no longer suspicious, but filled with anticipation, waiting to see whether justice would finally be called by its name. Lena Morrison stood beside row 12, trying to hide the slight tremble in her hands beneath her professional posture, but Anthony knew exactly what was unfolding inside her, a mixture of fear, hope, and a quiet belief that for the first time in her career, a powerless voice might not be silenced. Heather stood farther ahead, near first class, her hands clasped so tightly They had turned pale. No verdict had been spoken, but she knew she was standing at the edge of truth, with nowhere left to hide. Gregory took another call phone pressed to his ear, his face tightening with every word. He watched Anthony as he listened, his expression caught between admiration and the fear of a man who understood that one wrong move could drag his entire career into the heart of this crisis. The entire plane was quiet enough that the zip of a backpack at the rear could be heard. Then Gregory stepped forward, cleared his throat, and addressed the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice deep but slightly unsteady, "we are working to resolve an issue regarding the seat assignment error involving Mr. Caldwell. I am awaiting official guidance from our executive office." A voice sliced through the air, sharp and undeniable. Not an error. Discrimination. Everyone turned. It was the elderly man from Seat 3, Charlie. His face was firm, his green eyes bright under the cabin lights. "I served in the military," he said, "and I know when people make up excuses to hide something." I saw him being stopped, while the 5 passengers ahead of him, all white, were let through without a single question. A young woman in row 4 stood. I saw it too, and I heard the flight attendant say something about how not everyone belongs in first class. Heather's face blanched. "I did not. That is not what I meant. But you said it." Lena spoke softly, her voice blending with the faint flutter of the cabin curtain, yet every word hit like a hammer against a locked door. "And you asked to re-verify his ticket, even though you have never done that with any white passenger." Heather's breath hitched, struggling to force out an explanation. But the cabin had shifted. Every gaze now fixed on her not with blind anger, but with the heavy disappointment reserved for those entrusted with service, who instead weaponize their authority to judge. Gregory turned to Heather, his voice losing its polished composure. "Miss Collins, would you like to explain your actions?" Heather opened her mouth, but no words followed. Not one. Not a single explanation existed that could patch the hole now torn wide open. From the back, a soft clicking sound. Brandon was live streaming. "Thousands are watching," he murmured to Anthony. "The story, it has already gone beyond the aircraft." Anthony did not flinch. Not because of the spotlight, not because of the attention. He simply felt the weight of this moment, a moment that if he chose silence, could set change back by decades. Gregory's phone vibrated again. He listened for a long moment, his face draining of color, then stepped up to the cabin microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice steadier now, "per instructions from our regional director and executive leadership, we will proceed with a formal investigation. During that process, Ms. Collins will be removed from this flight immediately." Heather froze. "You cannot do that." "I can," Gregory said firmly, "and I must." 2 supporting attendants approached. Heather looked around desperately, searching for a face that would defend her, but all she found were tired, disappointed eyes. Eyes of people exhausted from witnessing what should never happen. As Heather was escorted off the plane, a silent gust swept through the cabin. No applause. No cheers. This was not victory. This was the exposure of a truth that should never have needed revealing. Gregory turned back to Anthony, his voice lower. "Mr. Caldwell, we apologize. The airline will be issuing an official apology within minutes. We are preparing the press release now." Anthony nodded slightly. But it was not enough. Not for him. Not for everyone who had lived through this without cameras, without witnesses, without a captain standing on their side. The cabin fell silent as Gregory continued. "We would like to invite you back to your first-class seat now. and to meet with our representatives in San Jose to discuss systemic improvements. Anthony met his eyes. "I will return to my seat," he said, "but I want every passenger on this plane to hear why I was reassigned, and the true nature of this so-called system error." Gregory inhaled deeply, then nodded. He handed Anthony the cabin microphone. The aircraft went silent once more. Anthony looked down the aisle, his gaze sweeping across every row, across faces filled with sympathy, shame, discomfort, or awakening. "I am not saying this because I am a CEO." He began, his voice low resonant, as if speaking to the entire world outside the plane. "I am saying this because I am a passenger just like every one of you, and I was treated differently, not because of a technical issue, but because of prejudice." A collective breath tightened. Someone gasped. Brandon's camera moved closer. This Anthony raised the manifest Lena had given him is proof that no seat change was ever made. No technical issue, no weight concern. Then he raised the 1 Alpha boarding pass. "And this is the seat I paid for." Across the cabin, expressions shifted from shock to something deeper, something like recognition. "But the most important part," Anthony continued, "is not that seat 1 Alpha was taken from me. It is that this has happened to countless others, people who had no chance to speak up, no evidence to defend themselves, no one to listen." Lena bowed her head, tears falling. A passenger whispered, "Someone finally said it." So Anthony said, "If the truth must be spoken today, I will speak it. Not to ignite anger, but to give fairness a place to stand." Gregory remained still, his face flushed but respectful. Captain Sanders nodded. Brandon filmed slowly, deliberately, trying not to miss a single second. When Anthony handed the microphone back, applause broke out. Soft at first, then louder, then rolling through the cabin like a wave. Not because he won, but because they realized someone had finally stood up for every moment of silence that came before. Anthony drew in a deep breath. He knew this was only the first step of a much larger fight, but at least today, on this plane that had not yet taken off the balance of power, had shifted. And for the first time in many years, Anthony Caldwell felt the sky standing with him. When the final applause settled, the cabin still vibrated, as if the air itself had not yet adjusted to what had just taken place. And in that moment, Anthony Caldwell stood in the aisle like the center of a tectonic shift. Everyone understood was larger than a seat, larger than a flight, even larger than him. Gregory swallowed hard, adjusted his headset, and hurried toward the cockpit. But before stepping inside, he glanced back at Anthony with the look of a man who had just watched a wall of pretense collapse before his eyes. The cockpit door closed, and seconds later, the muffled rumble of urgent voices seeped out like whispers from a crisis summit. Anthony remained standing, leaning slightly toward the window eyes, fixed on the long runway, where the Seattle sky lay under a thin, cold grey sheet of clouds. But what hung in his mind was not the weather. It was a single word repeated twice: the system. A system that had grown far too comfortable deciding who belonged and who did not. A system of which Heather was only a small fragment, but unfortunately the fragment most people encountered. Brandon approached phone, still recording his voice, low but electric, as if standing at the edge of a massive storm. "Do you know what you have just done? The entire internet is exploding. This story, it is becoming an epicenter." Anthony turned toward him, his expression free of pride or excitement, holding only the grounded calm of someone who had waited too long for a moment like this. "I am not looking for an epicenter," he said. "I am looking for the truth." Brandon's eyes brightened. And sometimes the truth is exactly what shakes the world. The cockpit door swung open again, sharper this time, and Gregory stepped out with a face drained of color, as if he had just stood before the chief executive officer of the world. Beside him was Captain Sanders, silent, but carrying a storm behind his eyes. Mr. Caldwell, Gregory said, his voice cracking under pressure, "The regional director would like to speak with you directly over the intercom. She is on the line with the company's CEO." A wave of murmurs rippled through the cabin like a burst of static. Several passengers raised their phones instinctively, sensing something significant was about to unfold. Anthony stepped forward and stood beside the cockpit door. The intercom crackled, then Rebecca Monroe's voice came through, no longer stiff with corporate politeness, but tinged with exhaustion and caution. "Mr. Caldwell, first, I want to say, we have been monitoring everything that has happened, and I want to make clear this is not how our airline treats its customers." Anthony cut in immediately, his tone sharp enough to slice through the thin veneer of diplomacy. "But it is how your employees treated me." A long silence followed. Passengers held their breath. Brandon moved the camera closer, and Lena placed a hand over her mouth, afraid to make a sound that might disturb the gravity of the moment. Rebecca exhaled audibly. "I will not deny it. We have reviewed the security footage at Gate Bravo 14, and the employee's conduct was not in line with our standards. It was not just a procedural error. It involved elements of discrimination." The cabin erupted in murmurs. A man exclaimed, "I knew it." A woman let out a breath, as if finally hearing someone admit what everyone else had seen. Anthony closed his eyes briefly to steady himself, then opened them. "Thank you for your honesty. But I need to know, what will the airline do now?" Rebecca's voice shifted from cautious to solemn. "We have notified the chief executive of Northwest Skies. He would like to speak with you directly." Anthony waited. Then a steady, resonant male voice filled the cabin. Mr. Caldwell, this is Charles Remington, Chief Executive Officer of Northwest Skies. I will be direct. This incident has gone far beyond a single flight. It has become a crisis of reputation and trust, and I will not allow it to continue." The cabin fell into absolute silence. No one moved. No one dared breathe. His words inside the confined space felt like the ruling of a Supreme Court. "I want your perspective," Charles continued. "In your view, what should we do?" Anthony did not need time to think. He had carried the answer his entire life. "I want every frontline employee retrained on unconscious bias." He said each word landing with the force of a hammer. "I want a transparent system for passengers to report discriminatory treatment without fear. I want the airline to publish publicly the data on these incidents. And I want protections in place for anyone who has suffered abuse of authority, as I did today." The cabin went still, as if the air had crystallized. This was no request. This was the framework of reform. Charles answered without hesitation. "I agree." A collective exhale swept through the plane like pressure, releasing from the cabin walls. But Anthony was not finished. "One more thing," he said. "Not just training, not just reporting. I want an independent advisory council with diverse representation to oversee these reforms. You cannot let the same people who created the problem evaluate themselves." Gregory's eyes widened. Lena covered her mouth again. Brandon whispered, awestruck, "He is rewriting the rules of the airline industry." Silence filled the intercom. A pause so long, a little girl in row 16 whispered to her mother, "Is he winning?" Then Charles spoke. "Mr. Caldwell, if you are willing, I want you to serve as an honorary advisor in building this system." The cabin exploded in astonishment. No one had expected that. No one imagined an airline chief executive would invite a passenger, a victim, into the room where reforms are born. Anthony remained silent for a few seconds, the silence of reflection of responsibility of a lifetime, witnessing injustice, and believing he had no power to change it. "I accept," he said, "but as a citizen, not as a CEO." On the line, Charles gave a soft, sincere laugh. "That is exactly why you are the right person." When the intercom disconnected, the cabin erupted into the loudest applause of the entire ordeal. Some passengers stood. Lena cried openly. Brandon lifted his phone and whispered into the live stream. "Ladies and gentlemen, you just witnessed history." And amid the thunder of emotion, Anthony sat down for the first time in hours, not out of exhaustion, but out of understanding. A far larger battle had just begun, and he, whether he wanted to or not, had become its face. But inside him there was no pride, only a single thought. If today can change something for the person who comes after me, then every risk was worth it. The aircraft trembled lightly, like a deep breath drawn by the sky itself. Not because the engines stirred, but because the world was preparing to move in a new direction. Slowly, but undeniably. When the intercom clicked off and the cabin settled into the echo of prolonged applause, Anthony did not move immediately. He simply placed his hand on the nearest seatback to steady himself, as though his body were suspended between emotion and reality, between the storm of change and the quiet stillness forming at his core. Brandon approached, still recording, but for the first time since the crisis began. His voice softened. "Do you realize how big this is? You just made an entire corporation bow its head." Anthony did not answer. He looked down the long aisle where every pair of eyes held something both familiar and new gratitude. Not because he was a chief executive officer, not because he held authority, but because he had stood up for those who never could. Lena Morrison stepped quietly beside him, her eyes still red but burning with determination. "Mr. Caldwell," she whispered just loud enough for him to hear, "thank you. I have seen this happen so many times. No one has ever been able to make them face it." Anthony turned to her, holding her gaze for a long moment. "You gave me information you could have kept to yourself," he said, gently but firmly. "You are the brave one here, Lena. I simply said what needed to be said." She shook her head, her lips trembling. "No, you broke a wall we were all afraid to touch." Anthony placed a hand on her shoulder, a light touch, but one carrying the message of an entire generation. "We are not alone." Then Gregory approached, adjusting his tie, taking a deep breath like a man bracing himself for a responsibility heavier than his frame could bear. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "we have prepared the internal announcement that will be sent to all passengers once the plane lands. Chief Executive Officer Remington is also drafting a public statement for the press. And per your request, I will explain the seat reassignment right now." He stepped up to the cabin microphone. Every head lifted, every breath paused. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gregory began, his voice slow deep, finally stripped of evasion. "Mr. Caldwell was moved from his first-class seat due to a decision rooted in discriminatory behavior by our employee. This was not a system error. This was individual misconduct that violated our company's values, and we apologize." A young woman pressed a hand to her chest, eyes glistening. The elderly man in 3, Charlie, nodded firmly. Brandon panned the camera across faces, capturing every reaction. Gregory continued, "We are taking immediate measures to correct this and to prevent it from happening again." Another wave of applause rose, stronger, more genuine. And this time, it was not just for Anthony. It was for every voice that had ever been silenced. Anthony looked around the cabin, letting his eyes rest on each expression. He felt as if the entire world was shifting alongside him, and that feeling was indescribable, the resonance of hearts long bruised, finally being acknowledged. Gregory turned to him. "You may return to your seat. 1 Alpha is waiting for you." For a moment, Anthony's breath caught. Seat 1 Alpha. It had always been his. But some things are returned not because of a ticket, but because justice has demanded it. Anthony walked down the aisle. Passengers moved aside, not out of fear or deference to status, but out of respect. Each footstep he took carried the weight of everything that had occurred, each contact of his shoes against the carpet echoing like a bell marking a turning point. Lena followed a few steps behind, like a quiet escort, and Brandon filmed beside them, understanding that every second was history. When Anthony reached first class, Captain Mitchell Sanders appeared at the doorway. The silver-haired captain placed a hand on the frame, standing with the dignity of a commander, greeting a general entering a war room. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "welcome back to the seat you rightfully deserve." Anthony nodded. "Thank you, Captain." "No." Captain Sanders replied, his voice lower, earnest enough to touch thank you. Anthony stepped into row 1 Alpha, the black leather seat, the polished wood table, the soft amber glow from the window. But nothing in first class felt as luxurious as the sense of fairness restored. He sat down. His back touched the seat, not with relief, but with the assurance that things had been set right. Then the lead attendant for first class, someone Anthony had not seen before, approached and placed a glass of water on his table. "From us," she said. "Not because you are a chief executive officer, but because you did the right thing." Anthony thanked her. She smiled and left. Brandon peeked into first class. "Do you know how many people are watching my live stream right now?" Anthony raised an eyebrow. "How many? 4 million. Anthony let out a quiet laugh, not a laugh of pride, but of someone realizing that what he did today had expanded far beyond the boundaries of his own life. The cabin began to prepare for takeoff. The captain spoke over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Our flight is ready for departure. But before we lift off, I want to say that today we witnessed something important. Honesty, courage, and the refusal to accept injustice. Some passengers wiped tears. Others sat still absorbing the words. Some placed a hand over their hearts. I am proud to fly with all of you," the captain continued, "and I am proud that Mr. Caldwell reminded us that dignity is non-negotiable." When the seatbelt sign chimed on, Anthony inhaled deeply and closed his eyes. The aircraft rolled forward. Then the engines roared like the sky itself, declaring its verdict. We rise now, but this time, justice rises with us. The plane lifted, breaking through the grey clouds, and Anthony felt it clearly. It was not just the aircraft ascending. It was him. And a system that had long favoured privilege over humanity was beginning at last to learn how to see the world through the eyes of truth. As the aircraft pierced through the thick cloud layer and settled at an altitude of 35,000 feet, soft light filtered through the window and washed across Anthony Caldwell's face, illuminating the features of a man who had just endured a battle no one could see with their eyes, yet everyone had felt in their hearts. He opened his laptop, preparing to review the documents for his crucial negotiation in San Jose, but his hands didn't reach the keyboard. They paused, as if giving him a few seconds to breathe, to recognize what had happened before he moved forward. A crisis, a confrontation, an awakening inside a metal cabin suspended in the sky. Then a gentle tap on his table drew his attention. Mr. Caldwell Anthony looked up. It was Lena standing in her neat uniform, though her red-rimmed eyes betrayed what she felt. She placed a small envelope before him. "Some passengers wanted you to have this. Their statements." Anthony opened it and found a handful of business cards and hastily written notes. "I will testify if you need me. I saw everything from start to finish. Thank you for standing up for us." A small piece of paper from the little girl in row 16 read in careful handwriting, "I want to grow up like you." Anthony bowed his head slightly, his chest tightening with unspoken emotion. He held the envelope gently, as if lifting the fragile, priceless fragments of justice itself. Lena watched him, her voice trembling yet firm. "In 8 years as a flight attendant, I have witnessed 17 incidents exactly like this. All of them vanished into silence, because no one had enough power to make the airline listen. But today, you made them open their ears." Anthony set the envelope down and met her gaze. "Justice does not come from the one with the most power. It comes from the one who chooses to use power the right way." A deep quiet settled between them. Lena turned to continue her duties, but before stepping away she said softly, releasing her hope into the air of the cabin, "You changed my life today, Mr. Caldwell. And maybe this entire industry." Brandon appeared in the aisle and sat in the seat across from him. No live stream, no recording. Just one person speaking to another. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice lower. "Now I want to say this off camera. I have followed the tech industry for 10 years. I have seen you break stereotypes in places where people of color rarely last. But today I saw something new. You were not just a CEO. You were someone who rewrites rules." Anthony leaned back, eyes drifting toward the open space ahead, where white clouds drifted gently beneath the aircraft. "Brandon," he said quietly, "I do not want this to become a story about fame. I want it to become a reason why others never have to go through what I went through." Brandon nodded. "And I will tell the story exactly the way you want." He stood to return to his seat, but before walking away completely, he added, "You are not just changing aviation. You are setting a new standard for courage in business." Anthony looked out the window. The clouds stretched like an endless white sea, and far ahead, the sunlight shimmered like new possibilities. He remembered Marcus's message, remembered the upcoming meeting, a meeting that could shape the future of Caldwell Systems. Then his phone buzzed. A text from Marcus appeared. "Good news. The Horizon Tech Board is impressed that you defended your principles. They want to finalize the deal earlier than planned. A CEO with integrity," were their exact words. Anthony let out a soft laugh, one tinged with relief and irony. He had stood up for dignity, and that act had brought him more power than any contract he had ever negotiated. At that moment, Captain Sanders approached with a cup of steaming coffee. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "we are entering calmer air. I wanted to bring this to you personally, by way of thanks." Anthony accepted the cup, but before the captain turned to leave, he asked, "Captain, do you think today will change anything?" Captain Sanders stopped, folded his arms, and gazed distantly, as though looking through the airplane's skin. I have flown for 32 years, and I have never seen a moment like today. I think it will change everything." Anthony nodded, and for the first time since the flight began, he felt truly at ease. Not because he had won, not because the airline admitted fault, but because today he had proven something the world often tries to ignore. No matter who you are or where you come from, if you stand up at the right moment in the right way, even the sky will pause to listen. The aircraft glided through the open air, carrying a story that had only just begun, but was already etched into the minds of millions. And Anthony Caldwell knew this flight would eventually land, but its impact would continue to fly. When the wheels touched the runway in San Jose, the cabin trembled softly, but no one moved, as if everyone aboard were waiting for the final moment that would close a journey they knew they would remember for the rest of their lives. Anthony Caldwell opened his eyes as the seatbelt sign switched off and drew in a long breath, feeling the warmth of solid ground return after what had been the longest emotional flight of his life. But before he could stand, Captain Sanders stepped out and spoke through the intercom, his voice more solemn than any routine landing announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for flying with us today. We did more than travel from Seattle to San Jose. We witnessed another journey, a journey of justice and dignity." Applause swept through the cabin again, long and resounding like waves, striking a rocky shore after a storm. Anthony rose to his feet, and for the first time in hours, he felt his legs unburdened by the weight of responsibility. Passengers near him reached out to shake his hand one by one, the silver-haired man, the young woman, the college student with trembling hands. "Thank you for not staying silent. Thank you for standing your ground. You made me believe goodness still exists." Lena approached her face, bright though still lined with the faint redness of shed tears, like someone who had finally set down an invisible burden carried for years. "Mr. Caldwell," she said softly, "you may not realize this, but flight attendants like me, we are always afraid to speak up. Today you gave us hope." Anthony placed his hand gently over hers, a simple gesture layered with meaning, gratitude, respect, and a promise that he would not let people like her continue fighting alone. The aircraft door opened. Noon sunlight poured into the cabin like a stage curtain, lifting to close the first act of a much larger story. In that very moment, Anthony understood deeply that this was not a period, but a comma, a turning point leading toward new pages of responsibility and action. As he stepped into the jet bridge, 3 reporters were waiting with microphones raised and cameras pointed directly at him. "Mr. Caldwell, can you share? Are you planning to sue the airline? Do you believe this is an isolated incident or a systemic issue?" But before any of those questions could pierce through him like a volley of arrows, Brandon Hughes stepped forward, lifted a hand to block them gently, and said firmly, "Give him a moment to breathe. We will speak when the time is right." Anthony looked at Brandon and nodded with deep appreciation. He did not need the camera's spotlight now. What he needed was to move forward calmly, not as the victim of an aviation scandal, but as a leader preparing to face one of the most important boardrooms of his career. A company driver was waiting near the exit. "Welcome to San Jose, Mr. Caldwell. The Horizon Tech Board is in the meeting room." Anthony stepped into the car, the door closed, and the noise outside separated from him, the way night separates from dawn. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let his mind piece together the day's fragments, the applause, the apology, the truth revealed. Heather leaving the plane. Lena speaking out. Brandon live-streaming the airline's chief executive, apologizing directly. And most of all, the way the passengers looked at him, as if he had lifted the curtain from something they all had seen, yet no one dared to name. His phone vibrated. A message from his wife. Maya, I saw everything. You shine like sunlight. But remember, I love you, not because you fight well, but because you always choose what is right even when it is hardest. Anthony read the message several times, a tired but warm smile forming like a small flame being reignited in his chest. The car stopped in front of Horizon Tech headquarters. The tall glass tower reflected a pale blue sky, a calm sky after a storm. Anthony stepped out, straightened his tie, and drew in a deep breath. He had come here to finalize a $300 million deal, but after everything that had happened, he realized success was not measured only by contracts or company valuations. It was measured by the mark he left on the world. He entered the meeting room. The entire board rose to greet him. The chief executive officer of Horizon Tech, a kind-faced, silver-haired man, approached and extended his hand firmly. We watched the entire situation, he said. And I want to say this clearly. You are exactly the kind of person we want to work with. Someone who defends the truth. Anthony returned the handshake with a steady smile. And I believe in partnerships built on dignity. The meeting began. And for the first time in his life, Anthony felt every door that had once been half shut now open completely. Not because of who he was, but because he had stood up in a moment when others would have bowed. As he presented, every eye in the room watched him with genuine respect. No one questioned him. No one underestimated him. No one asked if he belonged there. Because the answer had already been written across the Seattle sky hours earlier in action, in words, in the resolve of a man who refused to let injustice fly higher than his dignity. And Anthony Caldwell knew today he did more than close a deal. He opened a new chapter for himself, for the airline, and for the millions watching. Flight 2374 had ended, but the journey of truth had only just begun. From the perspective of a specialist in organizational behavior and the culture of justice in modern environments, Anthony Caldwell's story reveals a truth that never grows old. Systemic change does not always begin in boardrooms in strategic drafts or in million-dollar figures, but sometimes on an airplane when one person chooses not to stay silent in the face of wrongdoing. True power does not lie in status or in a first-class ticket, but in the ability to use one's voice to protect dignity, both for oneself and for those who do not have the privilege to do so. The moment Anthony stood up, redrew the boundaries of what we accept, and set a new precedent for justice in the service industry, reminding us that every act of courage can become a spark bright enough to change the entire sky. If this story inspires you, please like the video to help spread its message and subscribe to follow more journeys where people rise for the truth. Before you go, comment the phrase, "Stand up," as a reminder that justice begins with a single step, and that step must come from us